I have with us someone very, very special. He was part of the Republic Summit jury recently, Sriram Balasubramanian. He's an economist and a best-selling author, has had a stint with the IMF, based in the US these days. Sriram, where are you based? Where are you talking to us from?
That's right. I'm right now back in the US. Yeah.
Right.
Namaste.
Namaste. Namaste. So he's out with his book, Dharmanomics. It's already a bestseller. It's being discussed across the country. It's called Dharmanomics, an indigenous and sustainable economic model, and it's available on most platforms. And I want to talk about this book, Dharmanomics. Uh, Let me make it simple for all our audiences. What is Dharmanomics, first up, Sriram, and why is it important in today's context?
Yeah, thank you, Niranjan. Thanks for having me here. Always good to talk to you. Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think in today's times, there are a variety of new ideas which keep floating around as we pursue, Viksit Bharat. Um, um, my research deals with, two major questions, which I think is important for your audience. Um, which is the first question is, what are the indigenous models, economic models that Bharat had over the past? And as an extension for other countries as well, what is if for an aspirational superpower or a country which want to become a superpower, one notices that mostly they have their indigenous ideas as their foundation. So similarly, what is it for Bharat? So I think that's an important question. The second question is, what are the role of cultural norms and narratives, in our way of life? I mean, I define it the Dharmic way of life. What is its impact on economic choices, like what individuals like you and me make, or corporates or policymakers as well, since it has a profound impact. So as an extension of this, I spent almost a decade on my books. The first one was Kautilyanomics for Modern Times, dealing with Kautilya's Arthashastra, where I pitched this concept called Dharmic capitalism, where I define dharma through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and engaging with the rest of the world, harmony with the rest of the world. Basically ethics in terms of the institutions, in terms of leadership, in terms of governance, and in terms of engagement with the rest of the world, in terms of commerce. I mean, we have been continuously trading and having commerce with the rest of the world for much of our history, except for the post-independent period.
Yeah.
The 1990 reforms was basically back to the status quo in that sense, in terms of engaging with the rest of the world. That is another pillar. And lastly, on the role of responsibilities, the familial responsibilities, societal responsibilities, environmental responsibilities. And I map all this into a framework called Dharmic capitalism. In this book, in Dharmanomics, I take it a bit further, this is the second part of the trilogy. So it deals with the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Kambujadesa, and Cambodia, and the Southeast Asian kingdoms, where I argue that Kautilya's Dharmic capitalism played a role. The Dharmic ecosystem, essentially the temple-based economies, also was an important enabler of commerce beyond its religious identity. And it served as an important decentralized economic institution. And lastly, the role of guilds, we call the Shrinis, which were the sort of ambassadors of global commerce, maritime trade,
Yes.
right from Middle East to Bharat to Southeast Asia and Asia. So I show evidence and show inscriptive evidence, anecdotal evidence, as well as data to back this in this book. And the third part of the series is, of course, how some of these ideas apply to Viksit Bharat. So in very simple terms, the idea of Dharmanomics is highlighting these two research questions, which I mentioned, along with these components of both Kautilya's Dharmic capitalism, the Dharmic ecosystem, and the role of these guilds in our past, and
Yes.
how they drove economic prosperity.
Sriram, when we speak of Viksit Bharat, and that's the vision or the mission for the government, and most Indians, corporates, everyone is invested in this idea of Viksit Bharat, right? To We are aspiring to be a superpower. We are there in terms of, I mean, the recent headline being there's 100% growth in our GDP, right, in the last decade. Um, all of that, I mean, people wonder what has changed in the last 10 years, right? 10 or 11 years compared to how we were run in the past. But a lot of what has happened in the last decade also has to do with a certain way of thinking, perhaps, putting into practice what we have always believed in, our strengths as a nation. When you look at Viksit Bharat, uh, you were speaking about the indigenous model, the India model, right, as a foundation for our progress. What's your reading on that, and how important has that played in the growth of India in the last 1 decade?
Yeah, I think it's very important because see, I wouldn't characterize this as something new, right? If you really take a careful look of how countries which have become superpowers or aspirational superpowers, right? How they have pursued this path, for them to become superpowers. You would actually, when you really think about it in an objective, deep way, you will realize that, the foundations of their success, prosperity, is dwelled, the foundation has been through their own sort of indigenous or intrinsic ideas. So, for example, let's take the United States, right? The entire sort of modern day capitalism is based primarily on the Protestant ethic, which was, post the French Revolution, as the settlers, so-called, came to the United States. It is this Protestant ethic which sort of drived, their way of understanding capitalism, right? How they prospered. Similarly, for the Chinese, if you really look at how China's in the last 20, 30 years, really made so much progress in terms of prosperity and in terms of poverty alleviation. A lot of their ideas are highly decentralized at the grassroots village level, where it's attuned to a lot of the local intrinsic ideas. Similarly, for the Japanese as well, if you look at Japan's economy, uh, you know, its foundation structure is also dependent on this Japanese sort of ideas and ways of life, which is inbuilt to the Japanese, existence. So you find this much more in Asian societies, much more, intrinsically linked. And India and Bharat is no exception either. It's just that, we have a civilizational, way of life or cultural way of life for thousands of years,
Yeah.
which has been, there, which is going to be there, independent of other, geopolitical or macroeconomic factors, right? And this drives a lot of our consumer choices, especially non-discretionary spending, both at the individual level and at the corporate and the policy level. So in this sense, this is not something new, right?
Mm.
So in the last 10 years, as you see, I think you see a much more active representation of this, because we are taken much more seriously. So, for example, right, for instance, today, especially in international fora, you get a sense that Bharat's, not mere presence, but their presence leads to a serious engagement, which means Bharat's ideas are taken much more seriously. People want to understand why Bharat's becoming successful. What is what is the background to this prosperity
Mm.
that people are seeing, which India is Bharat is pursuing in its goal for Viksit Bharat. So I think there is a definite sense of greater recognition of not just its economic power, which people obviously is the front of its recognition, but also because a lot of ideas, whether it's the digital revolution, whether it is your response to COVID, whether it's the distinction with which we approach some of our policies, people are taking the ideas that Bharat represents much more seriously,
Yeah.
and they want to learn from it. I think that's a distinct difference. One could easily characterize it because of the new political setup, but I think this has been an aggregated feature post the economic reforms over a period of time.
Yeah.
Just that in the last 10 years, it's sort of accelerated quite a bit.
Yeah.
Given our increasing presence and strong global leadership.
Yeah. I mean, I get it. I mean, Indian idea is basically taking center stage.
That's right. I mean, and
Yeah.
not just to deal with one is to see how Bharat is moving forward. right?
Yeah.
What are some of the ideas that represents this growth that we're seeing, right? And second is in terms of global solutions. If there's an international conflict, now people look at Bharat as one of the ways or one of the people who could provide a solution to such conflicts, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of international issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's sustainability, whether it is peace resolution, whether it is multi-regional, say, trade corridors, in each of these areas, Bharat's ideas and thoughts are becoming center stage and a key decision maker. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
That change is visibly seen.
What is this indigenous Bharatiya economic model? Now, in your book and in your books and in this trilogy that you have planned, uh, why don't you tell our viewers what is the Bharatiya economic model over the centuries that you have read as part of your research? What is intrinsic to Bharat that makes us a great economic superpower?
Right. So historically, when you see, right, I mean, from whatever I've shared, I mean, there are two things, right? One is what is the historical, sort of model and how it how it was pursued, and what is the current situation today. So if you look at it historically, there is very little doubt that Bharat was a land of immense prosperity, right? Not just via the data. The data is one small element of it. I have some issues with some of the data, but the data gives you a good trend line, right? So a lot of historical data tells us that we were one of the top two countries in terms of per capita income
Mm.
and GDP, say from early CE onwards till about 17th century CE, right? But if you look at inscriptional evidence, you always find a lot of people who have inscribed extensive interactions of trade and commerce in all these inscriptions, which provide us the secondary evidence. And then there's anecdotal evidence, which is basically travelers who have traveled through Bharat. For example, these corporate guilds, trainees, which I mentioned, they had constituents who were from Israel. Jews were part of these guilds. You had members from the Middle East who were part of these guilds because they were all trading extensively in Bharat. Greek travelers, Chinese travelers. You find a variety of these accounts,
Mm.
showcasing this prosperity. And this prosperity, in my view, did not just come out of thin air. There had to be some sort of a framework, some sort of a thought process. So that's where this Dharmic way of life or this Dharma-based economic frameworks play an important role. So we mentioned about Kautilya's Dharmic capitalism, which is basically the role of a state, which is strong but does not micromanage, engaging with the rest of the world, talking about sustainability, talking about welfare, and ensuring that the real poor are provided the basic resources. These elements were definitely there in the past, right? Similarly, in terms of the role of these Dharmic ecosystem, in terms of the temple-based economies, right? The temples served as both labor aggregators, which provided employment to a decentralized area, to say a village, for example, right? If you go to any village today, even today in Bharat, you have one major temple and a variety of smaller temples which underpin that particular area. So, for example, if you take Prayagraj and the Mahakumbh itself, though it's not a temple, but it's still a representation of the Dharmic ecosystem, where because of a particular event, millions of people come to a particular area. And that creates a lot of economies of scale. And this is independent of how the economic conditions are, because people are coming there with, with a motivation for a particular purpose. And the entire tourism and infrastructure and the development that you see because of this creates economies of scale in the localized area.
Yeah.
So this, besides adding labor, it also was temple served as financial institution as well in those times. They were providing loans to some of these guilds. They also served as venture capital funds, right? For example, promoting localized entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So, for example, the Uttar Pradesh government has this one product, one village concept, which is a very interesting concept, where every village, they focus on a particular product, particular niche area, and then they expand economies. Similarly, in those times, temples used to finance these local entrepreneurs. And lastly, it also helped to reduce inequality because it got a lot of rich people. In fact, where you are at the moment in Bengaluru, the Vijayanagar kings,
Yes.
they were pioneers in ensuring that the rich people in a particular area would put together money in a sort of an endowment fund to run these temples, and the temples would provide free food for people who are coming below the poverty line at any point of time in the day. So 3 times a day they get free food, and the financing comes from the rich people in a particular area. In that sense, the entire modus operandi of redistribution, which we call in modern lingo, is actually done through the temple as a vehicle in this particular sense. So I think these were some ideas that you see in the past, which are very, very innovative for those times and are still relevant today. And coming to today, I think, why is it important today? Because the entire cultural way of life is what is determining our choices today. So, for example, if you want to buy a laptop, right, you have, say, 1, 2, 3 things that you want to look for while buying a laptop, right? These conditions, are driven by your upbringing and what you define as a reasonable laptop to buy. It could be financial reasons, it could be social reasons, it could be a variety of factors that evolve your decisions, right? It is the same. It is, to an extent, there's no big difference. Even if you did it thousands of years back, you might buy a boat, for example, instead of a laptop. But you would still take those 3, 4 decisions, which will enable you to make a choice. And this ability to make a choice is determined by a lot of factors, including cultural factors, which play a very important role. So that's why you notice that this extension of the qualitative, this Dharmic framework, which I'm showing, has a very important present relevance, because a lot of our consumer choices are determined by our cultural upbringing. And unlike the West, where, for example, in the West, the biggest expenditure that one makes happens during the Thanksgiving and the Christmas period. Whereas in Bharat, for example, it is a continuous year-long process, because you have a variety of events, variety of cultural events that happens across religions, which enable commerce, your discretionary spending to happen. So in that sense, it is a very real thing, that's there. It's very simple for a common man to sort of engage with this, but to sort of flesh it out in a very, in the lingo of a policymaker is very important, because only when you align to this way of life, when policy making aligns to this way of life, then it makes it far more effective than the other way around, where a bunch of guys sit in Lutyens Delhi and then bring in ideas which are probably anathemical to this way of life. So in that sense, I think, in the past, this way of life played a very important role, and there were certain parameters which I showcase through my books.
Yeah.
But even in the present, I think it's important to sort of take a step back and understand these things and try to make policy a bit more effective while aligning to this way of life, in my view.
Yeah, I sort of get it, because when you, or at least when I look at some of the governments, and you used a very, very fascinating example of redistribution via temples, right? Yeah, we do talk about redistribution, but it's completely warped the kind of debate that happens in today's public space, right? Redistribution as we knew it is not the redistribution that many politicians today talk about, right? Perhaps because you look at juxtaposing the Indian model versus borrowing models from other countries. And perhaps we have fallen prey to that somewhere, right? In the past, different governments have fallen prey to that.
Yeah, see, look, in the economic policy context, I think, unlike the sociological, sphere, which is different. I think in the economic policy context, it's just that a lot of policymakers, especially post-independent Bharat, while the intentions were genuine, it's just that most of them were either Western educated, or they came through, they were exposed to, a higher quality of life, much higher, right, than others. For example, I mean, in the early 1970s, my extended family was basically trying to overcome poverty. I mean, my grandmother couldn't have, say, twice or thrice a day food on the table, right? And I'm pretty sure, most middle class people would relate to this.
Of course.
That's how most of Bharat was. But most of the people who are the economic decision makers, or we're all doing, PhDs in international universities during this time, right? So there's a huge gap between what common people were experiencing and what some of the policymakers were, privileged about. So that naturally created a sort of I would say, a worldview which is slightly different to what people are experiencing. But post-liberalized Bharat, post the 1990s, things started changing. I mean, where you have the middle class really rising, where the products of the middle class have more exposure, more exposure to the rest of the world, and those people are now in decisions of power. So I think it makes a big difference because you are able to relate to a lot of the things even at your own family level because you've seen people going through such difficulty in their lives. So I think this is a natural process of change.
Yes.
And I think we should take the best practices from the rest of the world, use the best skill sets and the progress that we have made thus far. But for us to go to the next level, I think we need to also continuously reevaluate some of these things and see how, because eventually we have to take along the entire informal sector,
Yeah.
which is largely driven by a lot of these values, as we move towards Viksit Bharat. And the entire, rural slash semi-urban folks and get them along the way as we move towards Viksit Bharat. And I think understanding these principles and ideas would really accelerate this progress, in my view.
Yeah. Can this dharmic ecosystem, a way of thinking, find a meaningful place today in a rapidly evolving world where AI, right, is playing a big role?
Yeah, definitely, right? Because see, at the end of the day, more and more in an AI dominated world. In fact, I have a contrarian view.
Hmm.
I think, these ideas will gain more premium in a more AI driven world, right? Because essentially what happens in an AI driven world, right? Broadly speaking, right? Most of the things that are going to be automated, rote things are going to be automated to a large extent, right? So you really need enablers who can monitor, say, machines who can do a lot of these rote activities, right? But the premium really is on new ideas. The premium really is on principles on human interactions and how humans behave in terms of, say, consumer choices or a lot of perspectives on those issues, right? I think that's where, an inherent understanding of not just our past, but also how some of these things correlate in our present will also help. And I think we'll also move towards a principles based approach. I think that's how we need also approach this, right? For example, I'm not saying that everything from our past is glorious. I mean, there are many issues in our past, many things which are not relevant today, and there are many things which we need to move away from, right? But that doesn't mean you don't study the past as well. But what I'm trying to highlight here is there are principles, first principles, I call them first principles, which can be used for a variety of settings, including in an AI dominated world, of how do you deal with a particular challenge, particular policy issue, particular, and what are some of the principles that you use. I think a principles based approach also would make it more effective in a more modern world. Because as we become more and more modern, I think there is also an inherent need to use principles to guide us. Because eventually it's an uncertain world. Very few people know how this AI wave is going to, evolve, right? So I think a sort of a principles-based approach would be a very viable thing to do.
The last question to you is, you're an economist as well. That's primarily what you do. So how do you look at the way the Indian economy is progressing? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I feebly caught you say that you have a problem with the way the numbers are measured, but otherwise, what's your overall picture on where we're headed?
Yeah, so when I meant the numbers, the way it was measured, I'm not talking about the current context. I was talking, for example, the Angus Madison's data set, which is often
Right,
cited in a historical context,
right.
because the availability of data is very difficult to gauge in the past.
Yeah.
So most people just look at the data and then make assessments. I argue for a multi-prong approach, which is using the data, the trends in the data, the secondary research, and also the anecdotal research. So that was a reference. But in general, I mean, I think the world recognizes Bharat's commitment, I think, for inclusive and sustainable growth, especially in the way we have handled the pandemic. I think there's a very good recognition of how we recovered from the pandemic and the progress that we've been making. I think what people really understand that India is a country of 1.4 billion people, right? So we are at no point will we have something that satisfies everyone.
Yes.
But what people look for is stability. People look for leadership. People look for honesty in government, in governance in general, and also an ability to course correct on a variety of issues. And I think all these things, especially with the Honorable Prime Minister and his growing international stature, and the ability to look far ahead, set a goal like Viksit Bharat,
Yes.
and galvanize people through going towards that goal. I think these are all very important trends, important signs, of progress. And if you really take a step back and ignore all the noise, the quarterly noise, and just look at it from a bigger picture, I think we might not be perfect, but we are definitely making progress and making the right moves in the right direction.
Awesome. Nice conversation with you, Sriram, and looking forward to speaking to you sometime soon. And all the very best with your book and your future ventures. Thank you.
Thank you.